Hello and welcome again to this edition of Capitol Dateline. I'm your host, Brad Swanson. We're coming to you just a few blocks from Florida's Capitol, and we're in the third week of session. I am once again joined by our friend, Jim Saunders, Executive Editor of the News Service of Florida. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you.
We're right in the middle of all of it, so here we go. All right, so the first thing actually is not a Tallahassee-based issue, but it definitely impacts the very first bill that was signed during this session, and that's the death penalty. We have a state's attorney down in the Orlando area saying that she is not going to move forward with death penalty cases. What's happening?
Yeah, this was a big deal, and it's a surprise. It may be unprecedented in Florida. The state attorney in the circuit that includes Orlando and Osceola County, Aramis Ayala, announced last week that she was not going to pursue the death penalty in any cases. And this came about primarily because of the case of Markeith Lloyd, who was accused of killing an Orlando police officer here a couple months ago. But the state attorney, who was just elected in November, announced that she wasn't going to pursue the death penalty against Lloyd, and she also wasn't going to pursue it in any other cases. Now, she was raising issues that are fairly commonly debated in the death penalty world of, whether it's equitably applied and whether it's essentially whether it should exist or whether it's fair. But for a state attorney in Florida to announce that she is not going to pursue the death penalty across the board was, like I said, it may be unprecedented in Florida, but it made big news. And the governor immediately reacted. He appointed a special prosecutor, or outside prosecutor, I'm sorry, probably it's a better way to put it, Brad King out of Ocala, to prosecute this Lloyd case, which, presumably Brad King may pursue the death penalty in that case. But it kind of leaves open what happens in the rest of these capital cases that are going on in Orange and Osceola counties. I mean, it's a big place. There's a lot of murder cases. So how she's going to handle those going forward is a little bit unclear. But this sent a major ripple through law enforcement, state government. We had legislators rushing to condemn her. We had the governor rushing to condemn her. We had Attorney General Bondi rushing to condemn her. And so it was kind of a bombshell there towards the end of last week.
How normal is this, or how out of place is this for a governor to go in and grab a case and move it?
Well, we kind of looked it up in state law whether he could even do it. I mean, he cited a statute when he did it, and we were like, how can you do this? So we looked up. I mean, there does appear to be language that he could do that.
Right.
But interestingly, the rest of the state attorneys in the state on Friday put out a statement and said, we are going to continue pursuing the death penalty where appropriate. Right. So she's kind of out here on her own on this issue. I think there's a lot of practical implications too. How is she going to work with law enforcement down there? Because we are in this case that's brought this all to the fore is a cop killer case. So, the law enforcement, will this damage her relationship with them? But as you alluded to, I mean, this comes right after the legislature passed a bill and Governor Scott signed it to try to get the death penalty moving again. It had been sort of in legal limbo for the past year because of U.S. Supreme Court decisions and Florida Supreme Court decisions. So the first week of the legislative session, the legislature signs this bill to, again, try to fix the problems with the death penalty sentencing system, get the process rolling again. And then she comes out with this. It was pretty shocking, or pretty surprising.
Yeah, I mean, you think about, Lieutenant Clayton's sacrifice, in the course of trying to catch Markeith Lloyd. That is the ultimate sacrifice of law enforcement, and that is a huge community. So you just wonder. Typically, your state's attorney is working hand in hand with the sheriffs and the police officers. I mean, where it's appropriate and the right thing to do.
Well, like I said, the arguments she raised are not unusual arguments for death penalty opponents. I mean, they are the types of arguments that get raised in this debate all the time.
Right.
I think the unique part of it was that a state attorney was raising the issues as opposed to public defenders or someone on the other side. That's the unique part of it. But yeah, I mean, I think the fact that this is a cop killer case makes it even a more tricky thing to deal with. And like I said earlier, we don't know how this is going to play out in all these other cases. She was just elected. in November. So there is going to be 3.5 years or 4 years of her term essentially left. You got to figure there's going to be a lot of murder cases coming through her office. And how she will handle them. She says she's not going to pursue the death penalty. What will the governor's reaction be? It leaves a lot of questions for me in terms of how we go forward here.
Right. Well, we'll stay tuned to see what happens in that case. I know death penalty cases and just murder cases take a long time in the court.
Oh, that's true too.
All right, so let's shift back up to Tallahassee. Now, Floridians have a unique facet, if you will, to their Constitution, the document that guides the state, is that we have a Constitutional Revision Commission appointed once every 20 years. Now, 20 years ago, Florida was a completely different state. I mean, not just politically, but I mean, Republicans had just entered a leadership footing that they hadn't had in what, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, Reconstruction?
Reconstruction,
right.
probably.
So there was parity, if you will, back then as to the appointees. Today, it's a Republican governor, a Republican speaker, and a Republican president. What is happening with the commission, and where does it go from here?
Well, the commission is starting to meet now, Monday. It's an initial meeting. And it's going to take a long time for this to play out. It'll be more than a year probably before the commission actually proposes constitutional amendments that would go on the November 2018 ballot.
And that's really what affects Floridians, is the fact that they're going to propose rule changes to the fundamental rule book, if you will, that can alter certain directions, correct pieces of legislation or constitutional structure that can really change the direction of the state.
Well, and I think that's the thing to keep in mind, because I think we can get all sidetracked on commissions and the wonky sort of back politics of all this. But the reality is that when voters go to the ballot, go to the polls in November of 2018, they're going to be probably faced with some issues that this commission puts forward, and it's very likely there could be some controversial issues.
What are you hearing?
Well, I think one thing that a lot of people think that this commission is going to deal with is redistricting. In 2010, the voters approved the Fair Districts Amendments, which were intended to prevent gerrymandering, but they led to a ton of litigation over the past few years and required redrawing Senate and congressional districts before the 2016 elections. Legislators are very unhappy with that process. And the House Speaker and the Senate President appoint quite a few members of this commission. So I think that's one thing that we are going to see them address. But there's a lot of other rumors, speculation about what may be addressed.
What's possible?
For instance, one of the issues that's always been out there in terms of abortion cases in the legal world is a privacy clause in the Florida Constitution that makes restricting abortion very difficult in Florida. And there's been a lot of case law and a lot of cases on it. And so that could be one issue. They could try to address that privacy clause. It may be a slight alteration of it, but it might be enough to open the way for abortion opponents to get some things passed, restrictions passed that have not been passable in the past. I think there's talk about somehow addressing language that would address school choice. Again, there was a Supreme Court opinion about, it was about a Jeb Bush school voucher program that struck that down. And again, there was constitutional language that was at the heart of that decision. We got a lot of people in control of the governor's office and the legislature who are very big school choice proponents. It's not too far-fetched to think that their appointees to this commission might want to address that issue. So there's a lot of things like that. I mean, there are all kinds of, Richard Corcoran, the House Speaker, has been pushing to put term limits on Supreme Court justices and appeals court judges. That is the type of thing that this commission could address, assuming the legislature does not. So there are all kinds of things. There's probably a lot of things that none of us have thought of at this point that are out there. But going to your point, or initial point, times have changed a lot. And if you look back at the 1997-98 commission, it was, 15 of the members were appointed by Lawton Chiles, who was an old-style Democratic politician in Florida. This year, that same number is appointed by Rick Scott, who is a conservative Republican, very far away from Lawton Chiles politically. The chairman back there was a gentleman by the name of Dexter Douglas, who was a longtime Democratic attorney, friend of Lawton Chiles. Now it's Carlos Baruf, who's a developer out of the Manatee, Sarasota area, who's very conservative and close to Rick Scott. So, I mean, that's just an indication of the type of change of tenor of what we're going to see this time versus what we saw 20 years ago.
So when Floridians go to the ballot box after these come out, now, will this be the same single source structure, or can they be blended amendments? What are we looking at?
You know, I don't think they are under the same restrictions as as a citizens-driven initiative. I do think one thing to always keep in mind about these is it's going to require 60% approval to pass any of these things. Right. So that is something that's in the Constitution as well, and I don't see that changing. So that is a big difference from where we were 2 decades ago, because at that time, all you needed was a simple majority. So I think going into this commission process, they're going to have to think about that. Can we get 60% for these changes?
Right.
You know, they don't want to go so far that it makes it impossible to pass. But so that's a pretty significant change.
Well, campaign consultants are probably celebrating all around, because once these come out, they'll all be hired to go market to the Florida.
Well, as we've seen, there's been a few ballot initiatives over the years that have brought in a lot of money for consultants and advertising firms. But yeah, so again, it's hard to tell what they're going to, you know, what's going to be on the ballot. But there's probably going to be some pretty high-octane, controversial stuff.
Right. Well, that should be fun. I'm sure our friends in that world will celebrate, and we'll make them pick up the tab at lunches across town.
They seem to do fine.
Not for you, but for me. Okay, so let's move from the Constitutional Revision Commission to an issue that is directly in the middle of session, and that's the budget. Where does that stand, and what's coming next?
Well, the latest is that a group of economists met last week and sort of revised some budget or tax numbers, and the bottom line they came out of it was things really didn't change too much. And
How so? What do you mean change?
Well, they go in and look at all the general revenue that helps fund schools and healthcare and prisons programs, and they said that basically the state's going to have about $115 million more next year, during the next couple of years, than they had anticipated. But in the whole scheme of things, that's not that big of a change. So where we are is that this year's the budget that the legislature is going to be working on right now, it looks fairly tight, but it's not going to be in a shortfall. They're going to have a little extra money. But the next couple years is what they're worried about, because these projections are showing potential billion-dollar shortfalls unless spending is cut on some of the programs that, you know, are already out there. So the dilemma for the legislature, I think, is, you know, how to address this year's budget, but also take into consideration the next couple of years. Right. You don't want to put a bunch of new spending in this year's budget.
That will require subsequent spending.
Subsequent spending in the next couple of years. We've already got the House talking about, they're raising scenarios of deep cuts in programs this year. The Senate has gone through some similar exercises, but we are not hearing that much from the Senate as to deep cuts. And meanwhile, the governor has proposed $600 million in tax cuts, increased spending on education, and he doesn't, you know, his budget didn't really reflect what these economists are saying so much. You know, we're going into the budget process right now with kind of people in different positions. Not a lot of money compared historically to what they've had to play with some years. And so everything's up in the air. I mean, the Senate appropriations committees or subcommittees were supposed to meet this week, and they called off the meetings. I'm not sure whether that's because they need to digest these new numbers, right, or whether they're just trying to figure out how to approach this.
Could that be a harbinger for them setting up for a special session? I mean, do you think that's one of those chips that gets moved out there? If you're out for a full week in this very tight session, what does that mean?
Well, this ordinarily would be the time when budgets are coming together. Third, fourth week of session, each chamber starts putting together their budgets. Right. They pass them out, then they go into negotiations. That's just sort of the way it generally works. So it does look like, you know, things may be moving a little bit slower. I think there's a lot of people who think we're going to wind up in a special session this year over the budget. There's also a couple other issues out there that could wind up in a special session. But I mean, there's a lot of speculation that that's what's going to happen. I mean, the House Speaker has even raised that publicly, that's a possibility. So you know, there's always a lot of saber rattling through the budget process. But I think this year there's a lot of real differences, And how that plays out is still to be seen, and it could be weeks before we really know how that's going to happen.
All right. Well, that's one that we all will see every week as that one marches along.
I mean,
so.
they got to pass a budget by July 1st. That's also part of the Constitution.
Right.
So they have to do something on it now. Whether it's in April or May or June, we don't know. So.
Awesome. That would be great.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be nice if they did it on time as well. All right, so let's shift from the all-encompassing budget, that is the ultimate oxygen stealer, if you will, to an issue that Floridians are all over the board on, but people in the legislature always want to really go after it, and that's red light cameras. Anyone who's had a ticket can't stand them, right? Anyone who has been affected by a intersection collision, sometimes they're proponents of it. You have people all over the board. What's happening in red light camera world?
Well, the House is supposed to take up a bill on Wednesday, the full House, to repeal the state laws that allow red light cameras.
Right.
Essentially, they would ban local governments from having red light cameras. It would be phased in over a few years. I think 2020, they would be required to pull them. The House is, a lot of House members have opposed red light cameras for a while, including House Speaker Richard Corcoran. So, one of the arguments that the opponents make is that these have become revenue sources for local governments. Essentially, they're using these cameras to make money. They have not been able to move. This bill has been out there for a few years, and it's never been able to move through the process. And already it's stuck in the Senate. They couldn't get it out of the Senate Transportation Committee, which split on the issue. So I'm not really sure that it's going to move through this year. But the House is looking to push it again. And it's relatively early in session. There's still avenues that things happen. But the other side of it says these things have helped. Help protect safety.
Melissa Wandel is probably the chief spokesman in the state of Florida.
The widow of a man who was killed in one of these, and the law is named after him. So, there's a lot of pushback from safety advocates to repealing this law. Also
pushback from the cities that are
by the cities, also by the companies that have contracts to run these red light cameras. We have seen, some companies are throughout the state have contracts to run them. So they lobby up heavy on this issue as well. So I think at this point it's a long shot that there would be a repeal, but the House is going to move forward. I would bet that they will pass it out this week. And then we'll see what happens in the Senate.
Right. So, all right. Well, we'll stay tuned for red light cameras. If somebody gets a ticket, should we have them send it to you as a complaint? No. Okay. All right. No, we'll pass on.
I got no money.
All right. Well, Jim, thanks so much for your insights. We'll stay tuned daily for your briefs, and we look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today's Capitol Dateline. Make sure you hit us up on our Facebook page at Capitol Dateline Online, or connect with us via Twitter at the FCTA. Thanks for joining us.